All right, welcome to the first episode of the Jay Burden Show. With me today is Paul Fahrenheidt, and I met Paul in person through the Lotus Eaters Discord group, and we had a really interesting conversation. But more importantly than that, I'm here to talk about a Substack that Paul wrote about a month ago about the South and a statue that had come down on his campus. So, Paul, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Jack. Yes, so as has been said, my name is Paul Fahrenheidt. I am a writer on Substack. I have been more or less active in these sort of spheres for about, I'd say about half a year now. And I mostly write stuff about, history, about, I'm a fiction writer as well. I think I've written something in pretty much every genre on my Substack. You can also find my work for the publication Praxarchy. That's Praxarchy.com. And I've written a couple of articles over there as well. So yeah, that's just sort of a brief general introduction as to the stuff I've written and the stuff I do.
Well, great. So, do you think you could give a short summary of the piece you wrote on Substack and then a little bit of background about like what spurred you to write it?
Yeah, sure. So I attended a university in Virginia. For those who are familiar with the statue, they'll know what university it is, but it's a university in Central Virginia. And across the street from the main campus building, there has been a Confederate statue that stood for pretty much most of my college career there. And only when the St. Floyd thing went down did they take the metal soldier off the top of the statue, but they left the kind of pedestal standing. And a couple of weeks ago, I was walking to class and I saw sort of all Hispanic construction crew taking down this statue, and with two cops sort of looking on in their car with sirens on in the background. And I felt a deep sense of rage, of anger, of all those sort of emotions that comes when you would see such a thing. And so while I was sitting in class, I wasn't paying attention to the class because it was a trashy class. I typed out that entire article in a fit of rage. And I was generally in a sour mood most of the day. And it wasn't, what made it even worse, and this may be something we talk about further down the line, but what made it even worse was when I saw to where they were moving it to. There's a Confederate cemetery outside of the town my college is in, and they absolutely tore up the cemetery just to put that statue up there. And I just thought it was a completely inappropriate thing in a completely inappropriate place. And I don't think the whole affair could have been conducted with any more disrespect than it was conducted with, in my opinion. But yeah, the piece is just generally, captures my feelings on it, and the relationship that Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy had to my college town and had to all these other places. So that's all. That's what I got.
So it's interesting because I've had several experiences similar to yours. So I feel like a lot of the debate and the controversy around Confederate monuments really has been in Central Virginia. So in 2017, when this, at least I think, really got catapulted into like the national spotlight, I was living in Richmond and my best friend was living in Charlottesville. And as I'm sure you have heard, there was a major protest and counter protest in Charlottesville, right? It's infamous. But it's odd because I remember almost as soon as that happened, living in Richmond. And for those who don't know the city, Richmond is is famous for Monument Avenue, which is a World Heritage Site. It's a beautiful place with a series of Confederate monuments kind of at the heart of the city. And almost immediately in that town, the attitude shifted towards Monument Avenue. So Monument Avenue is in a very well-to-do part of town, and the monuments separate two-lane streets on either way. So in between the statues, which are roughly every 3 or 4 blocks, there's a park in the middle, and it's beautiful. There are trees on either side, the most beautiful homes in the city. And before then, it was very much this kind of heart of the civic life. There were children playing in the middle under the statue of Robert E. Lee, and it was a beautiful, positive thing. And almost instantly, it felt like the air got sucked out of the room. And all of a sudden, that was a shameful, horrible thing. And oddly enough, just a little bit earlier, the same thing had happened in Charlottesville. I have many good friends who were in Charlottesville at the time. And it's odd because, at least to me, it seems like the Confederacy was, until very recently, not as much of an issue in the popular conscious. I mean, there were jokes, and you see it in movies, right? Of the crazy old kook talking about the South will rise again. But it was very much not something that there was so much rage put towards. And obviously, ever since Charlottesville, it's kind of built and gotten worse. And what really resonated to me about reading Paul's Substack is I was there finally. All the other statues had been taken down. But the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond was still there. And it was covered in graffiti and, surrounded with, cracked out homeless people. But it was still there. And there was something kind of oddly noble about a statue of a man who, say what you will about him, had dignity, covered in the hateful attacks of essentially, miscreants. And so that was something I found really resonant. And so, Paul, you've been in the state roughly the same time I have. How would you describe that transition from the history of Virginia being something that, even if it wasn't looked at positively, was kind of in the background, to something that was kind of like almost like a totem of hatred?
Well, I want to compare Virginia to other southern states I've been to. And there are, like, South Carolina has a comparable sort of consciousness, as does, I think, certain parts of Alabama and certain parts of Mississippi. But really, Virginia is the only place, I think, where that sort of consciousness of the Confederacy being in every town in central Virginia. Like, there's a statue in, that there's statues that are in Orange County, there's statues that are in Gordonsville, there's statues that are in all these, central Virginia towns that have yet to be taken down. And really, I think that's just because, like, Virginia was one of these it was the state that gave the most of all of the southern states to the cause. More fighting men came from Virginia than any other state. More generals came from Virginia than any other state. More weaponry and more, supplies and machinery and money came from Virginia than any other state. And so, even back before, like, the massive shift in, 2015, 2016, 2017, that's about when it, like, really started hitting the road. This was just a normal everyday part of life that everyone just kind of accepted. It's like, well, the great Southern author Shelby Foote talked about the sort of compromise that happened between the northern states and the southern states. Like, the southern states admitted that it was probably for the best that the Union stayed together, and the Union, the northern states, admitted that, the Southerners fought and died for a cause they believed in. And what happened probably 2015, 2016, 2017 was that a lot of these tensions, and these tensions I think have been kind of building up under the surface in a certain college education, lecture halls, and in certain periodicals and magazines and the mainstream media and other places like that. And I think these sort of tensions have been building up for a couple of decades, to say the least, since the end of the Cold War. And at some point, I think they needed to be expressed. And, very much different from, like, your sort of 1990s. In the 1990s, that was like, Gettysburg came out, early 2000s, Gods and Generals came out. This was back when, like, the Civil War in the American consciousness seemed like something that everyone had more or less well and truly moved on from, and that both sides were recognized as kind of like, both fought for what they believe in. And, that was exemplified, as you said, by Monument Avenue in Virginia, by the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, by all of these small town statues. And I think as I think the wider zeitgeist, not just in Virginia and the South, is changing. And I think as a part of that, all of these sort of sectarian tensions, all of these battles fought in days past are kind of being, grave robbed and brought out to be battles of the present. And, just as the battle lines were drawn back then, the battle lines were drawn now. The hoity-toity, well-to-do people who do live on both sides of Monument Avenue, well, where politically, at least publicly, do their sympathies tend to be? They tend to be with the current thing because they are the elite. Therefore, as a part of staying with the current thing, the current thing is prostrate yourself, at least among the elite. It's prostrate yourself and disown your heritage and put all of these evil things that are evil into the past. And I think that's largely the reason why the shift occurred, is because it's not because, anyone had a problem with the place or anyone had a problem with the statues. And I remember having conversations back in 2016, 2017, like even with northern people who were like, well, the statue shouldn't be removed. It's just, you should add new plaques. And that seemed like just the regular, normal, sane path to take. But, what happened is that the elites opened up the floodgates and they let all the miscreants out, and they let all the people they let the what Francis Barker Yaki would call the underworld loose on all the streets to destroy everything that was good and beautiful and had a basis in something. So that's a very long answer to a short question, but that's kind of my thoughts summarized on the matter, on the sort of shift that occurred.
Well, I agree with you very much, and I think that we can't really emphasize enough how much I think the end of the Cold War played into this. Because I was listening to, I can't remember who was being interviewed, but it was the Good Old Boys podcast. And the thing that stuck in my mind is they were talking about the martial tradition in the South, which from a certain perspective is kind of odd. Like, why would this essentially conquered territory lend so many lives to the people who conquered them? But nevertheless, I mean, in our neck of the woods, right, the D-Day Memorial is in Bedford because disproportionately people from the South would enlist to fight in war. And it's this odd caste thing where very much, and Virginia is useful for this because Virginia is probably one of, if not the most divided southern state when it comes to culture, right? Like the top half of the state is not really southern and the bottom half very much is. But it does seem to me that there's almost a...
Sorry, my man. It's just, I want to yes and no for the northern part, for Northern Virginia. I don't mean to interrupt you, but a good friend of mine who's put some stuff into the Abbeville Institute and works with them has made the claim that basically Northern Virginia is the exact same as it's always been. It's just they went from plantation owners to sort of defense contractors, but the kind of people with the kind of attitudes, even the same kind of dialect, which you hear me speak with, it hasn't much changed. I don't mean to interrupt your monologue.
No.
I apologize.
And fair enough. I should clarify. If I said that is a new phenomenon, I didn't mean it. I don't think that's true. But what I mean is that whereas there are many states who are entirely northern or southern, if we can use those labels to mean anything, there are very few who are as distinctively divided as Virginia is, at least from my perspective, right? And I might be wrong on that.
No, I'd agree with you.
To me, like the DC area is almost indistinguishable from the kind of like the megalopolis that is the East Coast, Like DC blends into Baltimore, and I realize that's a drastic oversimplification. But I just mean that's kind of where the worlds meet from a certain perspective. But to go back to a previous point, just because I want to round this up, is it does seem that kind of like after the Janissaries weren't needed, right? Like after Ivan wasn't a threat anymore, there was this kind of building resentment to the culture of that class, and I think that even if it isn't conscious, there is this desire that like, oh, they can't have a culture to be proud of. And it is this odd, because you're talking about the compromise, and that compromise was built on a certain level of respect, right? Like obviously there's always been kind of a cultural chauvinism to New England Yankee culture, and fair enough, right? Like Boston conquered the world in a certain perspective. But there was always that kind of grudging, like, well, we need them, fundamentally, right? Like Southern Virginia fights the wars that Northern Virginia starts. But it's this odd, as that group of people became the deplorables, that part of their culture became equally as deplorable. And I agree with what you said, that this was building well before it broke the surface. But I think that the same attitudes that had Obama saying, these bitter clingers on, they hold on to their guns and their God, is the cultural attitude of, 2020, which says, well, we should have taken them down anyway. There's kind of the same level of resentment.
Yes, and kind of going off of that point, there's always been a kind of resentment of whether you call it the Yankee consciousness or the Puritan consciousness or whatever. This is actually a big motif in my writing, and you'll see it in other articles I've written. Is that America was birthed from two seeds. One is basically just cutting out East Anglia and planting it on the shores of Cape Cod, which grew to be Boston, and
Right,
then New
right.
England. And then the other one being the sort of the seed of the Cavaliers being planted in Jamestown and growing to be the South and the Mississippi Delta and Texas and the Southwest. But yes, I agree with you. I do think this is kind of this is an attempt, and it's a sign of decline, actually, because I think the South has been under occupation since 1865, and that didn't end, and that's still even with the economic consequences that's still being felt. 100 and how many 150 something. I can't do math, but basically for a very long time. I was listening to an interview of George C. Wallace, the governor of Alabama, when he went on Bill Buckley's firing line, and I think I brought this up before on other places, but Bill Buckley basically was treating Governor Wallace very poorly, very disrespectfully. And then Governor Wallace kind of comes out and says, look, import tariffs on steel produced in Birmingham, Alabama have been in place until the 1960s, right? The fact that the South hasn't recovered hasn't been because people in the South haven't wanted to rebuild, but it's been because the North has essentially kept some sort of boot on the South for literally over 100 years, almost 200 years. As soon as it gets to 2065, it will be 200 years. And I'm a pre-law student. So one of the cases I was reading, I forget the decision, I forget the specific case name, but it was decided in, I think, either 2010 or 2011, where whenever Alabama wanted to make a change to its election law, it needed to be reviewed by a panel of judges specifically selected from the circuit that is around Washington, D.C., and they had to approve any change in Alabama's election law. And when Alabama brought this up to the Supreme Court sided in favor of Alabama. It's like, well, look, you guys have no reason to keep meddling with Alabama's local laws. And that was as recently as 10 years ago, right? So, yes, and it, this sort of struggle, it's not as simple as North versus South anymore. It's kind of morphed into different things. It's not even really Republican versus Democrat anymore, I don't think. I think those are, or left, or even left versus right, but yeah, you do see this kind of this sentiment, this sort of hoity-toity ideas which birthed what the progressive movement are now, and ideas that birthed sort of the spheres that we move in. And that's kind of what the battle lines are. And this gets projected on every conflict, not just the Civil War, but even as far back as the English Civil War. There is very, very clearly a side that one side identifies with and a side that another side identifies with. And with the comments of Obama and the sort of neocon, neolib establishment, well, what's their founding mythos? The end of history. And when their founding mythos, the end of history, is challenged by dredging up history, that's when they'll kind of start looking down. They'll kind of start challenging, and they'll kind of start stepping on these people who want to bring up these roots, these things that matter, and get in the way of their sort of globalist, homogenizing, trite as it is to say, Great Reset project. And yeah, that's kind of what I have to say on what you've brought up in regards to Obama and the Northern sensibility, or at least the sensibility that the North possessed. Now I think it's evolved past that.
So, and I know that you and I disagree on, let's just say, metaphysics, right? And I don't want to get into this because that's a topic for another day. But I think that there's some insight to what, and he's not the only person to express this, but Thomas Sowell encapsulated this neatly when he basically says that the main distinction is those between who have a bounded and an unbounded vision of reality. And in many ways, it is a theological concept. And I think that what you see with the Puritans, and they get, I think, much more blame than they are due from a certain perspective. But it is very much this idea of we can realize the kingdom of God on earth. The idea that we can, and this is very explicit in a lot of America's founding myths, right? We can create the city on a hill. The kind of this idea that we can create a society without, war and conflict and all of these things, which, while they undoubtedly are bad, are essentially facts of the human condition. And so I think that you see in the way that history, especially around this conflict, is treated, it is not, well, people were acting within their own limited rationality. It is this idea of kind of like an eternal moral crusade. And you recently, not to, just reference your own personal life, you recently took a trip to Harper's Ferry, correct?
Yes, I did.
And I feel like if you want to see the vision or the version in action of the unbounded vision of the idea of creating, the perfect world, coming into contact very harshly and sharply with reality, there's no better example of that than John Brown.
Yeah, and speaking to John Brown, you can actually hear my mentor Thomas777 speak to him on my good buddy Oros's podcast. Oros did an episode with Thomas about the Confederacy, and yeah, John Brown was just essentially this kind of radical militant zealot that the North just kind of gave the okay to, and he went off and he did the equivalent of like Al Qaeda raiding, like say Fort Lee or something like that, and which I think the U.S. military is actually moving to rename all of the Confederate military name bases, and that includes all of the most famous military bases of the United States Army, which is Fort Lee, Fort Pickett, Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, Fort Polk, Fort Hood, and all of these other, all probably Camp Beauregard too. And so yeah, it's just a small little aside, but yeah, this is kind of like a sort of iconoclasm going out throughout the country, which this statue's kind of got swept up in, like the Confederacy and the idea of someone fighting for slavery, which is just a complete fabrication that started in 1862 when Lincoln essentially shifted the frame of the war to something about slavery. And this ties into sort of John Brown and this idea of the eternal vision, this idea that we can create this perfect, as you said, kingdom of God on earth. We can erase all of the wrongs and kill all of the people, literally kill all of the people who stand in the way of it, and be completely justified in doing so. And they'll all be damned to hell. And as a matter of fact, our morals compel us to do this. Right. And this is the sort of sentiment that informs your average everyday progressive. Is like, well, look, I have complete carte blanche to do whatever I can to these people, right? To do anything that's terrible, anything that's brutal and inhuman and unchristian, right? And I have complete just justification in it. As a matter of fact, not only do I have complete justification in it, I need to do it because I need to fulfill this eternal vision. I need to fulfill this idea of the kingdom of God on earth. And many would argue this does come from the Puritan consciousness. Many say it doesn't. It comes from other places. I don't really care to go on either side of that debate.
I agree with you. I just wanted to be as fair. There have been good things to come from the Puritan tradition.
Oh, of course. Well, and that's why that's
out of hand.
Yeah, and that's why I don't want to just throw them out. Because you're correct on that. At the same time, it needs to be understood that this is actually part of like the Faustian spirit. I'm a big Spenglerian. Anyone who talks to me, will realize that. But it's like, this is something that Spengler talks about quite a bit, is that one of the most compelling things of the Faustian man, the Western man, the Faustian soul, is to kind of create this purely abstract world. This world that has no value assigned to anything outside of this sort of Platonic conceptual ideal on earth, right? This means no borders. This means no race, no gender, no nothing. It is a world of pure abstract, pure, I don't want to say pure reason, but it's something that Kant kind of envisions, right? and Kant is kind of the archetypal figure who gives the philosophical backing of this sort of worldview. And this is something that we came up with at the U.S. event in Nashville. The left, and this largely came from Dave the Distributist talk. Very good. I would recommend anyone listening go check out his stuff. The left kind of envisions this world, and this is where things like the metaverse come from. Like, they envision this world where everything exists as kind of a simulation where the rules are whatever they want. Like, the ideal vision of a leftist utopia actually looks a lot like the ideal vision of a rightist utopia. It's just you take out all the white people and you make everything, renewable energy and all of that. But this is just a completely arbitrary fake fantasy land. And it's an arbitrary fake fantasy land that they're willing to die for. And they've been willing to die for since the days of John Brown, the days of Oliver Cromwell, since the days of Jan Hus and the Taborites, since the Cathars. There's precedent to everything. And to kind of conclude this series of thoughts, the word based, it's kind of not a lot of people say it other than ironically in these spheres, but the word based, the reason it has come into our consciousness is that it refers to based in reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is based in the world as it actually is, as it is experienced and has always been experienced by everyone, right? It is not participating in this fantasy land project that's been going on for the past couple hundred years, right? It is the world as what the perennial traditionalists call capital T tradition, the world as it's supposed to be, in the best of all circumstances before, the Kali Yuga, whether you believe in that religiously or as just a philosophical concept, before the Kali Yuga has kind of started claiming everything for itself. So this is why we are, Bronze Age pervert and other people call us the side of truth, because we stand with truth. What is truth? Truth is reality, and reality is history, and being based in it and having a connection and a concept of what has happened before you and what will happen after you from that. So I'm going to get off my soapbox real quick.
So to pivot from bashing the Puritans to perhaps the greatest contribution the Puritans have, imparted to the Western canon, Paradise Lost by Milton is mostly famous for being kind of a character study on Satan. And I love the way that he describes Satan's motivations for rebelling against God. So to zoom out a little bit, right? If you accept that, and we can talk about this in a philosophical sense, not a theological sense, right? The will of God is reality. And that a rebellion against God is a rebellion against the nature of reality. That's essentially what Satan does in Paradise Lost. And basically what he says is, I would rather, and it's a famous line, right? It's almost a cliche, like I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. And there's essentially kind of a similar instinct, and I think it's what Milton's getting at, is that there is this kind of, what some may say, satanic instinct in man to kind of rebel against the nature of, I'm from an economics background, so we'd say the nature of scarcity, right? And despite the fact that rebelling against reality, rebelling against scarcity never leads to the promised land, it leads to hell, either literally or figuratively based off your, creedal beliefs. But there is this draw to it. It's almost like we as people can't avoid it.
Well, yeah, and like I said, I wasn't bashing the Puritans. However, for their good and the bad, the Puritans kind of embody this sort of concept. Right. There's good and bad with everything. And I'm glad you brought up Milton, because you're completely correct, is that Paradise Lost is a very Faustian story. The archetype of Faust, the man who sold his soul for infinite power, that's almost a retelling of the Lucifer story. And you're completely correct with that. And you're right. It is this competition. This is one of the things I say is that the West has a lot to answer for. the West has a lot of sins it has committed. It has a lot of things it is broken with in terms of God and his creation that it will need to redeem itself for, in my opinion. And, one of those things is the fact that the West has kind of been putting itself in competition with God, which is exemplified with stories like the Faust myth, with stories like Paradise Lost, right? But at the same time, every time the West has a major sort of break with itself, where it almost reconsiders its break with God, that's when you'll see these massive wars. You'll see these massive sort of conflicts, like the English Civil War. The Cavaliers literally sticking with the divine right order of things, as opposed to the Puritans and their Calvinist conception of the world, for good or for ill. I'm not saying that this is a black and white thing. There were bad things about the Cavaliers, good things about the Puritans. Same thing with the Hussite Wars. There were critiques of the Church of Rome that could have been made. Same thing with the Civil War, right? There were good parts about the North. There were bad parts about the South. But it's just like generally each side tends to stick with, hey, look, there's a creation beyond us. There's something that, we need to kind of hold ourselves to. And then there's another side that either consciously or subconsciously says, no, we need to keep going on this project, this sort of a competition with God, this sort of making the kingdom of God on earth, right? Which the abolitionist and John Brown very much exemplify. And I mean, the Southerners had their own fanatics, but it was more of, it was really just two different consciousnesses coming into conflict.
Well, and I feel like that's in some ways, the deep truth behind the Promethean myth, right? Like Prometheus violates the rules of the gods. He steals fire. And that is both, in some ways, a blessing and a curse. Like he is, and according to the myth, the reason that humanity was able to advance. He gave them fire. But at the same time, he violated the will of Zeus or Jupiter and was condemned to spend the rest of his life in hell.
It was the fates. It wasn't Zeus or Jupiter. It was the concept of Moira, which is the Greek fate idea. It's what's woven by the three fates, the three sisters. Even the gods like Zeus and Jupiter need to follow along with it. And whenever you break fate, the concept of nemesis comes to basically correct you, and that's the Oedipus Rex story.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what you get from getting your mythology from Percy Jackson, right?
Zoomer moment.
Yeah, really, right?
Yeah.
So it's odd because I feel like this is a deep truth behind something that's kind of silly and stupid, right? Like the catchphrase, the left can't meme, while certainly true, I think that what you said about being based in reality is that kind of idea that like, oh, you don't need a graduate degree and, 3,000 words to explain this idea. And it's this idea that like, oh, there's something there. And you don't need to be so educated to fool yourself. And that doesn't mean that, oh, simple things are better than complicated things, by no means. But it is odd that such a relatively esoteric things, like you're talking about, like the spirit of this group, is something that is reflected down even to the level of like, well, why are lefty memes, 3 paragraphs and a horribly drawn soy jack, And it's odd because I feel like there is this line that's kind of culturally believed, not even on the sense that it's like someone tells you in school, but the idea that creativity and productiveness is inherently tied to that kind of like Faustian disdain for reality. And while that has been true kind of within the last 3 generations, that not only is that an aberration from the mean, but I think that the things created by that kind of Faustian spirit are fleeting. And the kind of things that we consider, to use the meme phrase, right, based, are the kind of things like Milton, right, that have that kind of deeper truth in them that enable them to stick around past kind of the zeitgeist and the moment they were created in.
Yes, I'm entirely with you. And the thing about memes Memes are an interesting thing that I think has already been studied more in depth than I ever could, but will be studied more in depth as the decades go on. One of the key things that brought together meme formats and, all, 50,000 of them that ever existed, right? It was just little vignettes of a reflection of reality, little vignettes of something that spoke to what existence is, that spoke to how the world be. Like, for example, it's just like sometimes it don't. I'm trying to remember the exact statement. Um, it don't always be that way, but sometimes it do, or some
Right,
shit like
yes.
that. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. I'm having a moment, but yeah, that's sort of a concept. It's like, it just be like how it be, and that's kind of a sophomoric, oversimplified breakdown of it. But in reality, that's kind of what meme formats reflected. And that's why, the more what we would call in our current conception, the more right wing stuff kind of had staying power and had appeal, is because it was based in reality, is because it did have a thing outside of itself that it was referring to. And it wasn't just this, like, weird artificial abstract construction that has like 4 paragraphs and you need to follow the whole 4 paragraphs to understand the concept. And you're right. That is why the left can't meme, because really they are the bearers of this, as you said, these Faustian abstractions that are fleeting, right? That don't have any, that don't have any basis in reality anymore. And something I've said before is that the West needs to die. Well, and this is because the living form of the West right now is leftism, right? That's all that's left for the West, right? Other than Caesars and other such things, if Caesars haven't already come, which is another theory I thought of. But that doesn't mean the forms of the West. That doesn't mean people like Milton. That doesn't mean Rembrandt. That doesn't mean all of these other sort of great cultural figures are just thrown down the trash. That doesn't mean that's not the West dying, right? But just as the West founded itself in sort of the ashes of the Greco-Romans, of the Apollonian, if you use the Spenglerian terms, there should be something new founded in almost the ashes of the West, founded with the West as its highest ideal, with the West at its best, which, in my opinion, is the Rococo court of King Louis XIV and the court of the Habsburgs, where Mozart was composing right on the eve of the French Revolution. That was the West at its cultural height. And I think ever since then, we've been trying to recapture that sort of cultural peak. And because that cultural peak was the perfect combination of Faustian will to infinity, rather, and basis in reality. And the Enlightenment, as much as people bitch about the Enlightenment, I don't think the Enlightenment entirely is to blame, but it is an indicator, is sort of the first general break from that. And from there, it has just been one kind of, up and down, but the general trend has been towards declining from that. And you see this in things like the Civil War. The Civil War was almost the French Revolution in America, a couple of years behind, a couple of decades behind, even more so than the American Revolution, which was really just a secession. So yeah, I mean, that's a bit disparate, but that's kind of what I have to say in terms of your idea of Faustian abstractions. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And I don't want to get too far away from the reason I wanted to talk to you in the first place, because we've gotten so far afield from the initial topic. So to kind of circle back a little bit more. So you wrote your Substack kind of as the statue came down. And it's odd because to me, I had a similar moment again after Lee came down, where I was watching because in Richmond, what they've done is they have not only taken the statues down, but they've essentially salted the earth around where the statues were placed. So the plinths are gone. The land underneath it has been physically removed and paved over. And I remember, because it was Jackson's monument specifically, and I remember sitting at the stoplight there on my way to the gym and watching a group of, I mean, they look like Zoomer stereotypes, like preposterously with the perms and the sneakers and everything. Hopped out of a Tesla to watch a bunch of, again, Hispanic workers physically break this thing apart. And they were laughing and taking photos of it and celebrating. And it felt like such a poignant moment, that at the same time that these essentially like the upper class of society, even if not literally, essentially, were kind of laughing and gesticulating and celebrating at what was originally intended to be kind of a solemn memorial of loss. And to me, it just seems so ghoulish and odd. Like the same that you would feel like if someone started playing music in a church service or something like that. And it's this disconnect between, even if you accept the premise that the men who fought for this cause did so wrongly, there is still a humanity to that and a sacrifice to that aside from the cause is noble. And it's kind of ghoulish and garish to use that as a prop in your personal life, as the background to literally doing TikTok dances. Was there anything like that around where you went to school with kind of the monuments coming down?
No, I didn't see anything like TikTok dances being done in front of monuments. At the same time, it was the same thing. It's like, they used these sort of golems, these people transplanted from their own soil and used as an undercaste of laborers, slaves without being called slaves, to do it. And that's the only people who really could have done it, I think. I did see one or two local workers, at least, white looking workers directing them, but like, I don't think. And it obviously wasn't publicized because, I'm sure the United Daughters of the Confederacy might have organized something, or there would have been some local backlash or something like that. So they just had to get it done quickly. And they were just, they always could hide behind the fact that, oh, we're just moving it. We're just moving it. We're moving it to the cemetery. We're not destroying it. We're not doing any of this other stuff. But at the same time, it's just when I went to the cemetery, and this is a thread, if anyone wants to, it used to be pinned, but it's kind of buried in my Twitter, but I did post a big thread on what they did to the cemetery and how they just kind of tore up the earth, and they didn't even have the courtesy to plant sod over it. They just, sprinkled it with like the cheap Walmart grass seeds. And I don't know. I mean, it really was like, one of the most disrespectful and callous and crude ways of probably getting rid of it. And to be honest, they did it because most people in the town probably didn't care as much. I'm part of a minority. We're part of a minority of people who care about this sort of stuff. At the same time, though, a very good friend of mine, when I told him about this and he read my article, he sent me a text because I was texting him about it, and he was telling me what I thought about this article. And he said, if there's any solace, it's this: you are watching the unmaking of Reconstruction. And I responded to him, I'm inclined to believe I'm watching its continuation. And he wrote something that was really profound that I wanted to touch upon. And he said, no, you don't understand why your conquerors let you have those statues. It was to reconcile you to their rule, to delude you that you were not in bondage. Only thus could they call the desert peace with a straight face. Their successors are arrogant and not so wise. Who among them cares as much for their victorious ancestors as you do for your defeated heroes? How many among them have victorious ancestors at all? They forget their own deceits, even as the force which backs them up corroded away. Defeat has humbled you. Victory has destroyed them. And this reminded me of something I wrote in another article that I released at 3 a.m. The same day I released this article about the concept of love, and I go into a bit of Vedic spirituality. But during the Mahabharata, which is the Indian national epic, the god Dharma, disguised as a lake, asks his son Yudhishthira a series of questions. And one of the questions he asks is, give an example of defeat. And Yudhishthira responds with victory. And when I read that thing that I just read out that my friend wrote, that kind of struck in my head. Is it's like, well, look, even if we win, even when we win, right? Say the Confederates did win the Civil War, or say a certain regime of Germans won a certain war, we would have the same problems, just a different version of them, right? Any victory in any war is a poison pill. It will eventually come back to get you, right? And when my friend said that, yeah, it very much is true. The competency of this sort of consciousness of this artificial creation is further and further and further slipping away. And more and more people are realizing that, this is not something to be supported. And so I don't know, I've kind of strayed far afield from your question, but that's something I wanted to say about the whole thing, about, this sort of jarring sensibility, like to the point where when you're literally dancing on the graves of, or on the monuments of the people you've defeated. This is why most of the world hates the United States, or at least the United States government, because a conqueror, a man who's conquered you, right? As long as he's respectful in victory, or at least, keeps you alive and doesn't humiliate you, you don't resent him the same way that someone who conquers you and humiliates you does. When the United States went into Afghanistan and sort of started teaching, like, gender fucking studies and like gay flags and all of that, that's humiliation. That's something that will have these people never forgiving the United States. That's why Russia will never forgive the United States, because we humiliated them as a country by putting Yeltsin into office. And, you can see this anywhere you look in terms of this whole thing.
Well, and I feel like to put a pin in what you said, it does kind of speak to the degradation of that culture, whatever you want to call it. That the virtues which made them strong, even if those were short term, right, have so corroded their ability to be effective. It's almost laughable. And there's an idea from Tolkien that's been bouncing around a lot, and kind of semi-ironic response to the Amazon Lord of the Rings series. But he has a quote speaking about, I believe, the creation of orcs, who are, in Tolkien lore, corrupted elves. And the idea, to paraphrase it, is basically the idea is evil cannot create, can only corrupt. And that is a Christian idea coming from him, but I think that there is something very much to that. That when you depart from reality, your ability to create and your ability to be effective, they go away. And obviously, I think we'd both agree that America of the 1910s and 1920s wasn't peak civilization. But it is interesting to see that the things that they created, those monuments, were beautiful and they were well made. But they haven't been replaced with new triumphs, with larger monuments, more grand ones. They've been replaced essentially with dirt, with nothing, with a hole in the ground. And oddly enough, I feel like that is almost a perfect metaphor for the situation we find ourselves in as a culture. Tearing something down to replace it with dirt.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And one of my favorite Psalms, forget the number of it, but it kind of goes like, for all things there is a season. And that's very much a perennial idea of this idea of things coming in cycles. And you're right, there are no new triumphs to replace this sort of dirt, because the old triumphs are no longer acceptable and must be torn down. And there is a part of a cycle, I think, when that sort of iconoclasm does come in, and we get so up, or at least those who are inclined this way get so up in their own moral outrage that they destroy something and have nothing to replace it with. And from there, I think that's actually, I think, one of the indicators that we are going into an era where new triumphs will be had that will be memorialized. And I don't know. I mean, my predictions for the future are actually somewhat more optimistic than most people. I think there will be times of struggle and transition, but also nothing like that lasts forever. And it's possible that even within our lifetimes, we'll see a sort of new, I don't want to say a golden age, but, possibly like a silver age or like a false recovery or something like that, where things seem to make sense again, at least for a little bit.
Well, I'd say that's a fairly hopeful note to end things on. So how about you give your plugs, then we can wrap it up.
Outstanding. Yeah, you can find most of my stuff on my Substack, the Fahrenheit Family Archives, at paulfahrenheit.substack.com. I will be releasing the first episode of my podcast, which will be for $5 a month, no more, no less. It's an Americana-centered podcast, and I'll be releasing that on Easter Sunday, which will be 4 days from now at the time of recording. And I have my mentor, my good friend, my guest, Thomas 777 will be with me for the pilot episode of that podcast. Otherwise, like I said, you can find me on Praxarchy. That's PRAXARCHY.com. And be on the lookout for some very long form fiction content that I will be releasing probably whenever I get it finished, whenever I get off my ass and actually get it done. You can follow me on Twitter at CavKingPaul. And, other than that, if you know what my Telegram is, then hit me up on Telegram. My DMs are always open. Anyone who's interested in talking to me will always find a way to get in contact with me. So that's all I really got. Thank you very much for having me, Jack.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. Have a good one.
All right.